would like to say that I came here in 1973 as a 7th grader, but that's not actually true. So, do your arithmetic. I'm a mathematician, so arithmetic comes easy to me. Thank you, Jamie. Before I introduce our speaker, Clare Asquith, I want to thank Jamie for giving me, first of all, for putting on this institute. Jamie, thank you very much. And also for giving you and me an opportunity to greet you this morning, and on behalf of our faculty, welcome you to Portsmouth Abbey School. Even though the sun is not out, it will come out, and I hope you're enjoying the peace and beauty of our Abbey campus as you participate in this morning's Portsmouth Institute, this weekend's Institute on the Catholic Shakespeare. Indeed, hospitality is one of the characteristics of the Benedictine institution, and we're pleased to be offering our hospitality to you this weekend. You should know that just 2 short weeks ago, and it seems hard to believe it was just 2 weeks ago, instead of having you all here, our campus was populated by 360 terrific high school age, grades 9 through 12 boys and girls coming from 25 states and 19 foreign countries. As such, our campus brings a wonderful and cosmopolitan environment on which our students and faculty live and learn together. Actually, when our students are here, I use the words joy and beauty rather than peace and beauty to describe life on our campus. As I explained to our faculty, joyful our students are, but peaceful is simply not in their job description. And respectful is in their job description, so that's much more important. Among the many highlights of this past year at Portsmouth Abbey School was the celebration of our 20th year of coeducation. We celebrated this milestone and the many accomplishments of the 107, our largest graduating class ever, by 7 students, actually, boys and girls, at the commencement ceremonies of the class of 2011 2 weeks ago. And at this commencement ceremony, we were particularly pleased this year to have Ben Stein as our commencement speaker. Ben did not disappoint in any way, shape, or form, as you can imagine. Portsmouth Abbey School is a private, coeducational, boarding secondary school that was founded in 1926 and is a wonderful place for boys and girls during their secondary school years to, as our mission states, grow in knowledge and grace, both social and otherwise, through an educational experience strongly based on a core set of Catholic Benedictine values and traditions. It is my hope that in addition to enjoying this weekend, you will leave our campus with an appreciation for our Abbey School, and that you will help us to spread the good word of this very unique and special Catholic Benedictine boarding school. So I thank you for that. Now it is my pleasure to be introducing Clare Asquith to you this morning. Ms. Asquith is a teacher, independent scholar, and author. She has lectured widely on Shakespeare in the United Kingdom and North America. Her undergraduate studies in English literature at Oxford University and traveling in Eastern Europe led her in 2005 to publish the book Shadow Play, The Hidden Beliefs and Coded Politics of William Shakespeare. I was kidding Claire before we started that. Here I am, a mathematician, announcing a Shakespeare speaker, but the part when I saw the word coded, it piqued my interest, so I like that a lot. Her book is a study of the impact on Shakespeare's work of the political and religious upheavals of his day. Subsequent to publishing Shadow Play, Ms. Asquith has taught, lectured, and published articles on Shakespeare in England, America, Canada, Italy, and the Ukraine. Ms. Asquith and her husband, Viscount Raymond Asquith, have 5 children and live in Somerset, England. It is now my pleasure to present to you Lady Clare Asquith. Clare.
Claire. I've had a request again. Would you please turn off all cell phones and Blackberries? It interferes with the audio part of the videography that we are hoping to get this onto TV in due course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and for that kind introduction. I'd like to begin today by taking you back to somewhere not so very different to where we are today. A rocky, forested peninsula surrounded by sea, a sea which opened out eventually onto the Atlantic and America. Because it was here, in 1599, on June the 23rd, the feast of St. Ethelreda, or St. Audrey, as she was fondly known in England, patron saint of fairs, it was on this feast day, the feast of St. Ethelreda, that Sir Rowland Stanley of Hooton married for the third time. He was 83 years old. His wife was one Jane Brown, and the wedding took place in the parish church of East Ham, near Houghton, in the Stanley lands on the peninsula of the Wirral, which you can see behind me, between Chester and the sea, close to modern-day Liverpool. And you can see East Ham at about 9 o'clock from the little ship sailing down past Liverpool. And you will see how very much the Stanleys were present in that part of the world. I don't know if there's a place called Stanley. You'll see it just close to East Ham. Now, though Sir Rowland was a respectable northern nobleman who had been in his time Justice of the Peace and Sheriff of Chester, Lord Burleigh noted that he was a recusant, and the government had reason to regard him with deep suspicion. Two of his sons were either Jesuits or lay Jesuits. It's not clear to me which. But what is clear is that his son and heir, Sir William Stanley, was the most notorious and dangerous traitor of the day. He'd been a celebrated general in Elizabeth I's army in the Low Countries who had defected to the Spanish, and throughout the 1590s had been expected to lead an Irish or Spanish invasion force against his own country. And we'll just see where I can make this work. Yeah. Just at the top of Wales, halfway up on the left, you can see the little peninsula where the Stanleys were. Very handy, actually, for any kind of invasion. You will see up there, it's about equidistant. Stratford is equidistant between London and the Wirral. Now, I want to propose today that this wedding was the occasion for As You Like It, usually dated by Shakespeare scholars to the same year as the wedding, 1599, and that old Sir Rowland's family concerns, including his son's sensational defection, were central to Shakespeare's adaptation of the popular pastoral novel by Thomas Lodge, Rosalind. Now, to link pastoral romances with, among other things, historical events is not as wacky and fanciful as might appear. As most of us here know, the pastoral is traditionally a vehicle for veiled contemporary allusion. Sir Philip Sidney said, "Under pretty tales of wolves and shepherds are whole considerations of wrongdoing and patience." What wrongdoing? Whose patience? Well, archaeologists have got to work on As You Like It before. Vilma Richmond has demonstrated that in the late 1590s the pastoral was essentially a dissident and often a Catholic genre. And Donna Hamilton argues more controversially that the brilliant and amoral dissimulator Anthony Munday, triple agent, used pastoral themes in his plays, including the story of Robin Hood, to perpetuate the memory of threatened Catholic beliefs and traditions. Catherine Duncan-Jones is just one of a number of scholars who see portraits of Ben Jonson and Shakespeare himself in Jakes and Touchstone, the two major new characters Shakespeare introduced to As You Like It, and I absolutely agree with that. At the Lancaster Conference in 2003, Carol Enos linked Lodge's theme of banished virtue with the Catholic concern with exile. She suggested that the fortunes of the recusant Horton family closely mirrored those of the unfortunate brothers in the play. The Earl of Essex, until recently the only serious Elizabethan dissident recognised by Shakespeare scholars, has periodically and, in my view, unsuccessfully been associated with the exiled Duke in the play. And then, of course, inevitably, the secret marriage of the Earl of Southampton to Elizabeth Vernon in 1598 has been proposed as an occasion for the play, which has true love and weddings as a very emphatic theme. And as far as I know, however, the Stanley family have not had a look-in, and this is curious because Shakespeare clearly has a very soft spot for the Stanleys. Of course, the scholarly Ferdinando Stanley, later Lord Derby, was probably his first patron. But for whatever reason, and we might hear in the talk on Henry VI later on, Shakespeare freely alters narratives in his history plays to favour the Stanley family. And according to the distinguished Shakespeare scholar Ernst Holliger, he may have been the author of the epitaphs on the Stanley tombs at Tom in Shropshire. So, if there is a historical element to Shakespeare's single pastoral play, and many scholars think there is, it would be reasonable to take a closer look at the contemporary activities of this powerful, rich, and therefore much courted northern dynasty. However, before putting a case for the Stanley presence in Anti-Lycan, I want to establish the accompanying presence of a deeper level, which runs through Shakespeare's work and most of his contemporaries, and which close readings, like the one I'm going to do, often obscure. This allegory is especially powerful in Shakespeare's comedies, and was, I believe, so recognizable that he refers to it apologetically in one of his sonnets. Why still write I all one ever the same, and keep invention in a noted weed? It required a highly cultivated Christian humanist audience to be understood. The intellectuals, courtiers, nobility, and gentry who were the inheritors not just of the stones of the dissolved monasteries, but the librarians of the books and the learning that went with them. Now, my belief is that these readers and spectators would be predisposed to see certain imaginary figures as the divided spirits, as it were, of the fragmented church. Fragmented for English onlookers into the dark, low church of Geneva, the high, fair church of Rome, the brown or hybrid established church of Canterbury and London. Now, George Herbert and John Donne both openly discuss the divided faiths in terms of these female personifications. And so a generation later does John Dryden in his poem about the divided English church, The Hind and the Panther, which some of you may know. Now, in her revelatory study of this poem, Anne Barbow Gardiner at last gives us what, in my view, is a convincing source for these apparently random personifications and attributes which I've previously drawn attention to, of reformers as dark, Catholics as fair, of hair, in disarray or tightly bound up, of eyes, steady and reflective, or misled, or even blinded and removed, of rosy lips and cheeks in danger from the side of time. Now, this newly discovered source for what I have called a code is the long tradition of scholastic and patristic commentary on the Old Testament's Song of Songs, the most sensuous and one of the earliest of all love poems, the object of ingenious and obsessive flights of fancy from the pre-Christian Jewish Talmud to Augustine, to Erasmus, and on down the centuries. Often these exegetes laid out the text as a drama with the characters down the side. And the song was seen in the Christian tradition as a dialogue between Christ and the bridegroom. As the bridegroom, and the church as the bride, or the soul, or Our Lady. The three were interchangeable, and depending on the commentator and the way you wanted to read it, you could choose which. But as we know, the church was often symbolized by Our Lady, the Mother of God. And there's this very interesting confusion between mother and bride. But I say this because one of the great observers of the appearance of Our Lady in the plays of Shakespeare is sitting as Peter Moore. Yes, I do. From early Christian times to the Renaissance, these great figures, the bride and Christ, mesh naturally with other majestic entities from the classical world: Psyche, Mercury, Venus, Diana, Cupid, and with the ancient Eastern and Neoplatonic tradition of mystical alchemy, opened up in recent years by Francis Yates. But the allegory also carried with it a more prosaic layer, the historical layer, protean by its very nature, but it had certain consistent themes. The church bride was always split into at least two entities. the unawakened section of the Jewish synagogue, the synagogue bride, which failed to respond to the incarnation, and ecclesia, the newer Gentile church, which did respond. The separated, wandering Shulamite bride, called by the bridegroom to return to the universal mother church, was usually interpreted as the worldly of Jews. But she could also be seen as heresy. Precisely which heresy depended on the standpoint of the commentator and climate of the times. Some influential commentators divided her even further into four brides spread out over the four corners of the earth, rich in, as you can imagine, symbolism, particularly from Allegory. Anne Matter's study of the Song of Songs, The Voice of My Beloved, traces this political commentary down through the Middle Ages and demonstrates that whoever they were, the separated brides were intended to embrace at the end of time in a mystical marriage with Christ. Here the church is snatching a stolen kiss from Christ on her journey. She hasn't reached there yet. And there's a wonderful line, let me kiss him with the lips of my mouth. This sort of seizing this moment when the bride reaches out to Christ, who looks a little bit surprised there, doesn't he? Now, I believe that Shakespeare, writing from the agonizingly fractured religious perspective in England, was the great poet of this moment of apotheosis, which emerged from the perplexities of love that he so famously explored, and which is particularly affecting, isn't it, in the eloquent fourth act of Love's Labour's Lost, and at the end of such plays as The Winter's Tale, Comedy of Errors, and As You Like It. Essential to this historical level was a detailed allegorical interpretation of that mother of all blazons, the bridegroom's enumeration of the bride's various beauties in the Song of Songs. A wonderful list. Now this literalist approach to the list is quite alien to us, but medieval and Renaissance minds clearly delighted in it. The head of the bride was, of course, Christ. Her hair, therefore close to the head, was the company of believers. If they hung downwards, worldly. If they were bound up, holy. Her eyes were the bride's doctors and teachers and guides. Her teeth, the interpreters of doctrine. Her blood-red lips, the martyrs, guardians of the precious teeth. Her cheeks, her chaste ministers. Her hands, her priestly angels, and so on. And the resonant line, Nigra sum sed formosa, I am dark but beautiful, threw the commentators into total disagreement, and they had a field day with this. Because the bride, or one of the brides, was clearly dark. But why? Darkness was ambiguous. So for some, it was the fundamental sinfulness of man, utterly dependent on divine grace. It was a good thing to admit that you were dark. For others, it could refer to the scorching fires of persecution. For others, it was the night of heresy. For others, it was a kind of spiritual sunburn, the effect of closeness to Christ the Son. So sometimes darkness was an attribute of the faithful bride, sunburn, or a humble admission of sinfulness. Sometimes the separated one, heresy or rejection of the Son. Now these ancient, separated, timeless, sacred brides are the women, I think, from whose eyes Byron, in Love's Labour's Lost, derives the doctrine of love. You remember he begins, from women's eyes, this doctrine I derive. And he's profoundly serious when he goes on, not ironic, calling the eyes of such women the books, the arts, the academes that show, contain, and nourish all the world. The presence of these women, adapted down the centuries to the changing fortunes of the church, hovers, I believe, behind Laura and Beatrice, the mystical sonnets of the 12th century, the works of later mystics, of course, where it's overt. Chaucer, some of Chaucer, which I find an affront to women, for instance, the terrible tale of Patient Griselda, suddenly changes if it's seen in the light of the romance between the divine groom and his bride, an interestingly completely secular adapter of Chaucer's Tales for the Royal Shakespeare Company, Mike Poulton, opened my eyes to this. I didn't see that then. He said, of course, this is about the relationship between Christ and his church, and suddenly it becomes very beautiful. The concepts of the bride's eyes, her blackness and her whiteness, proved particularly useful to writers who wanted to discuss doctrinal splits and schisms and heresies while avoiding censorship. And Petrarch was one of these. And Petrarch was taken up famously in England by Wyatt, Thomas Wyatt, in the 1530s, at the moment of the split in the church, and he gave the genre a distinctive English shot in the arm. Remember, in one of his sonnets, he calls Anne Boleyn, he has a cover name for her, a code name, which is brunette, because of course she was dark and she was Lutheran. And he rejects brunette, well, she's rejected him already. Brunette, he says, who kept the country, who set our country in a roar. Brunette, who set our country in a roar, is put on one side. Back he's gone to Phyllis, the golden bride, to whom he gives his wit, his will, his all. So he sets the tone. This is the first writer of sonnets in the English language, picking up whatever Petrarch was doing it further on. Shakespeare, Henry Constable, and Michael Drayton are examples of the later poets who portrayed fair heroines positively, favour the fair ones, although Shakespeare's often link arms with their equally virtuous, darker sisters. While for those with Calvinist tendencies, Philip Sidney at certain points, George Gascoigne, Fulk Greville, and George Chapman, for them, the beloved, the true beloved, is dark. They see the fair bride as proud and dishonest. She conceals her fallen nature with dye, makeup, and ornament. The honest, dark, unadorned bride, and I'm quoting Barone again, who is a dark bride now, she mourns that painting and usurping hair should ravish dotage with a false aspect. Samuel Daniel, very interestingly, actually changed his devious hair colour from fair to dark in the course of certain alterations to his sonnet sequence. It was forever tinkering with it. And this might be the result of Fulk Greville's influence. He came under Calvinist influence and was taken up by the Wilton House circle. Now this often fevered, elaborate intellectual game was approaching burnout, perhaps not surprisingly, by the end of the 16th century. Listen to Fair Rosalind's laughing response to Orlando's love poetry, which is beautifully cliched in As You Like It. And she says, I was never so berhymed since Pythagoras' time. Transmigration of soul. I was never so berhymed since Pythagoras' time that I was an Irish rat, which I can scarce remember. Now, we're accustomed, aren't we, to the presence of the Bible in the work of these writers, but not, I think, the commentaries, equally influential and seminal. What about Shakespeare? Do we know that he read, that he was interested in these commentaries on the Song of Songs? Well, yes, we most certainly do. Because the last line of the Song of Songs, given an additional verse, is this: love is a fire which water cannot quench, nor torrents drown. And the commentators saw this, read it symbolically, as the embrace of the universal church of Christ, crossing all denominations, all differences. Famously, Shakespeare's sonnets add up to 153, although the last one is 154. And his last 153 is the number of the miraculous draught of fishes, very much a favourite number at that time, symbolising the same thing, the universal appeal, the inclusiveness of Christ's church. And Shakespeare's last line is a paraphrase, acknowledged by Shakespeare scholars, of the last line of the Song of Songs. And Shakespeare's marvellous way of using dead simple, watery language to say something sublime. And it's hidden so successfully under the veil of the profane that you hardly notice the little note at the bottom says, this is the Song of Songs. And the line is, love's fire heats water, water cools not love. Thomas Lodge, in his Rosalind, published in 1519, also uses these perennial figures as something more than elements in an elegant Renaissance story. To thoughtful readers, aware of the likely identities of characters with names like Montanus, the prototype of the sympathetic heretic, Tertullian was a Montanist, Rosalind, Ganymede, Jove's cupbearer, Aliena, Saladin, and Roseda, the book explores the central question of doctrinal truth and religious persecution. Lodge was a Catholic, a London poet and dramatist who left England for France on religious grounds in 1597, and much of his previous work explored the question of exile. In one of his poems, he has Truth leaving England, saying, "You islanders adieu, you banished me before I fled from you." A clear picture of this woman, Truth, leaving England. Won't have her anymore. This poem and his novel, with its two virtuous female exiles, The Divided Truth, The Two Brides, Rosalind and Aliena, expresses the widespread perception that two forms of truth, fair Catholic and dark Calvinist, the Invisible Church, had been hounded out of England by the new hybrid state religion. Henry Constable, a Catholic convert, was one of a number of other contemporary writers who wrote sympathetically in his Examen Pacifique on behalf of both sets of victims, Catholic and Huguenot. The Forest of Arden, in which Lodge sets his novel, is generally agreed by Shakespeare scholars to refer on one level to the Ardennes in the Low Countries, the first resort of English exiles of both denominations, where they encountered the different complexities of the continental wars of religion, where it was Catholics who were the oppressors and Huguenots the victims. To return now with this grand, overreaching allegory in mind to Shakespeare's play. Shakespeare closely follows the plot of Rosalind, but he considerably deepens and expands both its cast of characters and its frame of reference. And in the rest of the talk, I want to show that these changes, while developing the original themes introduced by Lodge, all held its special significance for the Stanley family. That is, the senior Cheshire branch of the Stanleys, not their grander Lancashire cousins and neighbours, who, though they were the Earls of Derby, were technically a junior branch of the family. But the two families are very closely interlinked, obviously very friendly. Lord Strange, interestingly, built a hunting lodge on the coast of the Wirral. And William Stanley, as a boy, was educated and served as a page in the magnificent and famously hospitable household of the Earl of Derby, a little further north in Latham. And so, as it happens, years later, not very many years later, did Thomas Lodge. Lodge was also a page at the Earl of Derby's household. So he therefore, at least early on in his life, was a standing protégé, taking on a job once performed by the notorious exile, Sir William. And indeed, although it's Sir William's wedding, which I think is the occasion of the play, it's the role of the scandalous defector, his son, which is the most surprising and contentious aspect of this interpretation of As You Like It. A number of scholars have sensed that a particularly political identity lies behind the anonymous exiled duke. As we've seen, the Earl of Essex preferred candidate. But it should become clear from this brief biography of Sir William that many more of his circumstances fit the position of the exiles in the play than those of Essex. Like many Catholics of the period whose prospects in life were limited by the lack of education, he became a soldier of fortune. Shakespeare's frustrated Orlando, unlike Lodge's Roseda, complains constantly that he has been unjustly deprived of education and can only survive by means of the base and boisterous sword. Sir William fought first on the Catholic side with the notoriously cruel Duke of Alva in the Low Countries. Next for Queen Elizabeth in Ireland on the Protestant side, where he served for 15 years with great distinction, was knighted in 1579 in recognition of his military and diplomatic brilliance. The Earl of Leicester called him a pearl among men. But despite of this glittering reputation, he was passed over when it came to dividing up the considerable spoils in our retinue. was expecting an estate. But no, he was summoned over to the Low Countries by Leicester to support Dutch Protestant rebels. He brought with him his Irish soldiers. And here, his loyalty, already tested to the limit, was stretched to breaking point. In January 1587, the year before the Armada, he and his fellow general, Sir Rowland York, defected to Spain, along with their men, handing over the newly gained cities of Deventer and Zutphen in the process. Shock and horror were the reactions in England, but he became an instant hero to the exiles. And in 1586, Cardinal Allen vindicated his actions in a pamphlet seen even today and by Catholic writers as just too much, as actually inflammatory. Strike the Protestant historian wrote caustically, down came priests, thick and threefold, and generally men that for their conscience they dispersed in other parts, in hope of the great payment and golden world that was there talked of around so weak. And you remember, in As You Like It, Charles the Wrestler says, they say many young gentlemen flock to the Duke every day, and fleet the time carelessly, as they did in the golden world. Stanley never returned to England. Instead, he became commander of what was known as the Spanish Regiment, a haven for disaffected English soldiers and Catholics, drumming their heels, constantly waiting for a Spanish or Irish assault on the Protestant English regime. He was never entirely trusted by Spain, who failed to appreciate the value of his excellent political and military advice, which may very well have led to a successful invasion had they heeded it. To the Duke of Parma, Stanley was a man quite lacking in ambition, any sort of ambition, a rare accolade for those times. To the English government, he represented a constant threat, while his lieutenant, Jakes de Franceschi, was widely regarded as an outright villain. Stanley and his sidekick, Jakes, the names recur together many times in the nervy English intelligence reports of the late 1590s. But by 1599, the year of As You Like It, the invasion plans had faltered, the bickering Spanish regiment was disbanded. Stanley stayed on as advisor to the Spanish government, retaining a Spanish pension for the rest of his life, and was made governor of Malines in Belgium. After peace was signed with Spain, he pleaded to be allowed home with James I. He said he would be no trouble, and the height of his ambition was to live the rest of his days in Lancashire with beef and bag pudding. But in the end, his wife and son and grandson, very touchingly, left the Wirral and Hoodon to join him in exile in Flanders. And he was evidently a principled and devout man, strong links to the Jesuits, but became a Carthusian at the end of his life, and a great supporter of his cousin, the missionary John Gerard. Now, it's almost impossible to see how a story like that, coupled with the very different Song of Songs allegory touched on earlier, could begin to find a place in the richly human comic romance which for most of us is As You Like It. But we should remember that even the anti-Catholic of Fort Greville made full use of the old multiple levels of allegory, so antipathetic to modern scholarship. Perhaps the most helpful approach is to view As You Like It in the light of Renaissance art rather than Renaissance literature, a painter in which patrons take their place alongside protégés in a humble but visible place among the great religious, Neoplatonic and contemporary themes which they have commissioned. I skipped that, but it's an unknown painting of some treaty. I'd just like to look at the two sides, the dark and the fair on both sides. It's two women, just how they talked about it. Here's the picture. Very well known to all of us. It's Botticelli's Adoration of the Magi. What we don't know is, most of us, that man in red, kneeling conspicuously in the middle, very humbly, although he's a king. If you look close up, is Cosimo Medici, who commissioned the picture. And standing on the side, looking out at us, is the painter, Botticelli. It doesn't detract from the picture. What they're saying is, we made this picture. Sorry about that. Even more apposite to As You Like It is this marvelous picture by Pisanello. Again, it's the portrait of a patron who is undergoing a moment of conversion in the middle of a dark wood. And if you go close up, it's a very distinctive face. Underneath there's a scroll which should give his name, but it doesn't. It's humbly blank. And you remember the Duke in As You Like It is anonymous. You'll see the animals below, the dogs, doing base, lower instinct things, like sniffing each other's bottoms and growling at the crucifix. And above are birds like pelicans, representing the higher part of man. So it's a deeply mystical picture. And again, nowadays you can zoom in so wonderfully, can't you, on these pictures? If you can get this on Google Images, look at the face on the crucifix. It's the most wonderful depiction of Christ, but tiny. Are the Stanleys visible in As You Like It, in the way that the patrons I've just pointed out are at least visible? Well, in the absence of a portrait, a coat of arms is the first and most obvious signature of a patron. We know that in 1599, Shakespeare spent time in the College of Arms trying to establish his own coat of arms. And he knew all about the Stanleys. Back in the 13th century, one William Stanley made an extremely advantageous marriage with Jane Barneville, thereby gaining the region of the Wirral, which we looked at earlier, and all its wealth and all its convenient seaboard. And a key part of her dowry was a great hunting horn, a horn which was a magnificent object, and it survives to this day. Originally given to the family by Edward III as the guarantee and symbol of the master forestership of the Wirral. And it brought the Stanleys the title of Chief Ranger of the Forest of the Wirral, and remains to this day a symbol of Wirral identity. It's now the device of Wirral County Council. For hundreds of years, the family treasured the Stanley horn as a potent symbol of their tenure by Cornish, as it's called, of the Forest of Wirral, and thought to carry with it a symbolic duty to summon the country to arms, in the event of invasion. They also adopted a forester's crest, of course, a stag's head and neck with the tongue coming out, and their family motto, beneath the device of 3 bucks' heads, was Sans Changer. Now, the action of As You Like It takes place in a forestry setting, presided over by an anonymous duke, labelled for convenience Duke Senior in the margins, who is chief of the foresters. Now, all this broadly coincides with the motifs of the Stanley coat of arms, and perhaps with the seniority of this branch of the family. But I also think it likely that under the guise of bawdy banter, the full heraldic picture of the senior branch of the Stanleys is paraded before our eyes in graphic, concentrated form, in a short scene towards the end of the play, where it stands out as a tableau, it's at 4:2, like a heraldic cartouche pinned to the action. Lords, like foresters, enter. These are not real foresters, they're lords like foresters throughout. They're choreographed by Jakes, who you remember would probably been recognised as Johnson, the dramatist. One of them puts on the antlers of the deer he's just killed as a branch of victory, and lordly fellow foresters sing him home to the Duke like a Roman conqueror. So here is the deer's head, the Stanley crest, held aloft and connected with Roman military victory. There's still, incidentally, a tradition among German huntsmen that you, whatever it is, pipe a different song, a different tune on the horn for each animal you kill. So the fox has one tune, the deer another, and so on. And next, indeed, comes the horn in this little scene, because the refrain of this song alters from branching antlers to just the one horn. Listen to this. Take thou no scorn to wear the horn, it was a crest ere thou was born. Thy father's father bore it, and thy father bore it. The horn, the lusty horn, is not a thing to laugh to scorn. Now the dead deer's head, the title Roman conqueror, the need for the crest to be vindicated, the ancient heraldic pedigree, the lords who were also foresters, and above all, the horn as the repeating climax of the song, All this recalls the heraldic apparatus of the Stanleys, in particular the exiled Stanley heir and great Roman military general, Sir William. A little earlier, in Act 3, Scene 3, a Stanley audience might have detected another compliment to their Barnville inheritance. Remember, they got the horn and the land through Jane Barnville. When Touchstone jokes that a couple's horns are part of the dowry of marriage. You just get it. You get married, you're a couple. The dowry of his wife, 'tis none of his own getting. And in the end, by how much defence is better than no skill, by so much is a horn more precious than to want. Again, the plural horns, you see, have subtly developed and evolved into the singular, and the horn, by a typical Shakespeare sleight of hand, has become an instrument of defence, something precious, potentially noble, not funny. There's no room here to explore Shakespeare's other developments of the forestry theme, which is really worth pursuing yourselves and fascinating. For instance, the misgivings that Duke and James have about usurping the territory of the highly anthropomorphic deer weeping and exiled in the forest, or burghers. These strangely circumstantial passages accurately express the range of conflicting emotions and reactions of any exile in the Low Countries at this time, witnessing, or in Sir William's case, actually participating in the atrocities afflicted there by Catholic by Protestant. The same applies to the love affair between the forest shepherds. Look at that again, Sylvius and Phoebe, full of significance for those attuned to the sufferings of French Huguenots under the king they thought was their own, Henry IV, who then strategically, expediently changed religions to get the throne. Paris is worth a mass. Now all this, isn't it? It's not a thing actually to roll your eyes and tap your head. It's what was expected in a pastoral. Not for us, but it was then. It's talking about something else. As well as adapting Lodge's forestry theme, which itself may well have been Lodge's complement to the Stanleys, we have seen that Lodge belonged to the Stanley household. Shakespeare provides a second, more shadowy Stanley background to the play. This is the romance, then well known, of the Chanson de Roland, a bittersweet tale which is on one level literally Roland's song, and thus an elegant punning compliment to the bridegroom. But at the same time, the Chanson de Roland celebrates a courageous rearguard action against a pagan enemy which could from one point of view be seen as an act of folly. Roland was pig-headed and stupid in what he did. Now to highlight Roland's rash but heroic and suicidal action might just be to address the futility, the apparent futility, of Sir William Stanley's controversial political and military stand, and to set it within the perspective of chivalric legend, making it all right, by summoning up one of the most famous of all accounts of the Christian soldier hero, hopelessly sounding his horn. When in the pass at Roncesvalles, to alert his distant master, Charlemagne, to his death. Contemporary picture. Now Shakespeare directs us to this subtext by introducing new names to Lodge's tale and inexplicably duplicating them. They all come in twice, with an apparent carelessness which has always puzzled editors. The name Roland appears, replacing Reseda, in two conspicuous places. So the hero is renamed Orlando, a variant of Roland, and a new character, his dead father, old Sir Roland. So the dead father's name is Roland. Old Sir Roland is mentioned 8 times in the play, and with such repeated deference, indeed reverence, by virtuous characters, and such extreme disgust by the usurper, that old Sir Roland can be seen as the presiding genius of the play off stage, whose noble effigies and image are lovingly traced in the face of his son. In fact, when Sir Roland's name is first comes in, that's the moment that blank verse first enters the play. Next comes Oliver, the name of the legendary Roland's great friend and one-time adversary, And Shakespeare introduces the name Oliver again, twice. It is the name of Orlando's brother, also his one-time adversary, and also the name of the priest, Sir Oliver Martext, a more or less walk-on part, but whose name, nonetheless, Touchstone makes great play of, turning it into a jingle. Shakespeare also throws in the name of Roland's master, Charles. He's called Charles in the Song of Roland. Charlemagne, we know him as Charles the Great, wittily giving the name Charles to Lodge's apparently invincible champion wrestler. Now, all these names evoke the Song of Roland, particularly the most famous episode, Roland's death. Betrayed and isolated among the pagan enemy, Roland attempts to deprive his opponents of his magical sword by trying to shatter it against a stone, like sinking your nuclear submarine. Then, having refused until too late to summon help, he blows his elephant horn, or oliphant, to alert Charlemagne to his fate, dying in the attempt as the blood explodes from his head. Now, in a mock heroic moment, in As You Like It, Touchstone reminds the audience of this iconic episode, yet again under cover of low humour. I remember when I was in love, I broke my sword upon a stone and bid him take that for coming a knight to James' smile. A third name which Shakespeare unaccountably uses twice is Jakes. Jakes, the melancholy companion to the anonymous duke whose name is frequently mentioned, and Jakes, Orlando's brother, who barely has a role in the play. Now, this name has nothing to do with the Song of Roland, but everything to do with Sir William. As we've seen, Jakes de Franceschi was his friend and lieutenant, and the two names were frequently coupled in dispatches in the late 1590s. To give an anonymous exile a companion called Jakes, at this period, came very close to identifying him and was sailing very close to the wind. And my theory is that the duplication of the three names, Roland, Oliver, and Jakes, all draw attention to changes made in Lodge's very popular, often reprinted tale, to align it with the national issue of Catholic treachery embodied in the fate and dilemmas of the Stanley family. Shakespeare's emphatic identification of treachery with goodness throughout his play is surprising. Simply to be good in this play is to be a traitor, liable to banishment. His sources give a variety of motives for the banishment of various characters to the forest. Shakespeare draws a line through them, substitutes it with one motive: the hatred of vice for virtue, religious virtue in particular. Your virtues, gentle master, are sanctified and holy traitors to you, says Adam to Orlando. Rosalind's numinous goodness alone makes her a traitor. Adam's selfless constancy, according to Orlando, is not for the fashion of these times. Oliver's soul hates nothing more than his gentle, enchantingly beloved brother, and so on. The unjust slur of treachery, along with the unjust deprivation of education, which are the most striking additions to the opening of the play, were two of the major preoccupations of all English Catholics at this time. Peter Millward aptly relates the wording of the usurping duke in this play as he banishes Rosalind to the precise wording of Lord Burleigh's attack on English Catholics in his execution of justice in England. And so William Stanley's defection was the most extreme instance of this debatable form of treachery. Finally, to turn now from Sir William Stanley the exile to his father the bridegroom. Two motifs introduced by Shakespeare to Lodge's tale, extra ones, are those of marriage and old age. The loyal retainer Adam embodies, as we've seen, noble and devoted old age, and his recipe for a long life might have come from the lips of the virile Sir Roland himself, who was to die at the age of 96, the oldest knight in England. Though I look old, says Adam, yet am I strong and lusty. For in my youth I never did apply hot and rebellious liquors to my blood, nor did not with unbashful forehead woo the means of weakness and debility. Therefore my age, the word is repeated, is as a lusty winter, frosty but kindly. The long perspective view of old age also lies behind Jakes' famous speech on the 7 ages of man, and Orlando's more compressed reflection on how brief the life of man runs his erring pilgrimage, that the stretching of a span buckles in his sum of age. And there's a story that one of Shakespeare's brothers dimly recalled. They asked him, "Can you remember your brother? You know, any anecdote at all?" He said, "Well, I can remember one thing." "Yes, what is it?" "Well, I remember him being carried on stage by an actor on his back." And so ever since, people have felt that Shakespeare probably acted the part of Adam. And one can imagine that for the play's author to take this role in front of Sir Rowland might have been a direct compliment, stressing the significance of a role which movingly embodied the values of the threatened old order in England. At the same time, Shakespeare foregrounds the whole business of marriage in all its forms. The lover and his lass concern lodge, but Shakespeare stresses weddings, when bells do ring, the only pretty ring time. And as the theme of weddings gathers pace towards the end of the play, with comic input from Touchstone and Sir Oliver, so does the grand theme of the mystical wedding, bringing transcendent union to all the plot's painful divisions. Hymen in person, the god of marriage, and the god of every town. Here again, Shakespeare's typical use of the banal to conceal the divine. This comes close to Christian God. The god of every town appears on stage at the end to wed no fewer than 4 couples. The spiritual and political level comes to a climax here, as low brown Celia and tall fairer Rosalind are reunited with followers who have learnt about selfless devotion the hard way, shedding their besetting faults and delusions in the tough school of real love hinted at the end of Love's Labour's Lost, the school of exile, where the words of Mercury are harsh after the songs of Apollo. This grand apotheosis is initiated by a sublime antiphonal celebration of true, indeed religious love, articulated by the humble shepherd Sylvius and echoed by all the others. And I say religious. One of the words that's repeated, the attributes of this love, in this short passage by Sylvius, a beautiful passage, is the word observance. It is observance. Rosalind, not for the first time, takes on a divine aura. Hymen from heaven brought her, we learn. Summing up the many religious conversions and awakenings that have happened in the forest, all the bad people are converted, Hymen paraphrases delicately Christ's words about converted sinners. Then is there mirth in heaven, when earthly things made even are turned together. Tempering and enriching this high doctrinal tone is the comically earthy relationship between Touchstone and the frustratingly proper Audrey, who will only allow consummation of love within marriage. Touchstone's approach is so crude and breathless that Jakes halts the ceremony and takes him off for a bit of marriage guidance. "Go thou with me and let me counsel thee," he says. Now this thread of homely jokes about love, sex and marriage would have appealed to a robust country audience celebrating an octogenarian wedding. And here it is worth repeating that Sir Rowland was married on the feast day of St. Audrey. And the name Audrey, butt of so many of the jokes about marriage in the play, occurs nowhere else in Shakespeare's work. And to me this is a strong indication that Sir Rowland's was the marriage the play is intended to celebrate. The first historical mention of Asquith is in a staying order in the Stationers' Register on 4th of August 1600, but it only reached print 23 years later in the first volume, evidently taken from a very tidy original, according to editors. There's no reliable record of a performance before that, and no quotations from it in contemporary literature. Why not? It's Shakespeare's, in his finest and most popular style, and from the mid-18th century on, was constantly performed. Now, there are 2 possible reasons. One, that it was written as a private commission, and the second, that it contained politically sensitive material. Both these possibilities would fit the bill if As You Like It was indeed written on the occasion of Sir Rowland Stanley's wedding, and if it did indeed contain, as a graceful wedding present, a masterly vindication of his son's career of the honour of the Stanley crest and horn, and of the exiled beliefs for which the Stanleys, the country, and indeed Western Europe, which is touched on beautifully in the place, had suffered so much. Thank you very much. I've gone on probably much too long, so if anyone has any questions.
We have time for a few questions.
Are there any suggestions of these things?
Please use the microphone.
Are there any suggestions of the codes, et cetera, that you explicated as you like it in the title itself as you like it?
I merely mentioned that. Of all his take it or leave it titles, like What You Will, it does seem to be that doubleness is there. Isn't it? Two names, two names, two names. You can take it two ways. I'm sure that's a little nudge. Oh, Pisanello, Pisanello, and it's in the National Gallery in London, and it's called The Vision of St. Eustace.
Thank you, Claire, for the marvelous context for that play. But let me ask you a fundamental question.
Yeah, reading this.
Did you assume that Shakespeare's audience could perceive these contexts and arguments in the play? Okay. How did he get away with that?
Well, the normal answer that I would normally give to that question, because it's the first question to ask. Why conceal something which everyone can easily understand? You're using, after all, a common language. He didn't want not to be understood. He was simply dodging the convention. The convention was you just didn't talk about these things that way. You talked about them without mentioning the words, which is first ingredient of humour. Anyway. But at the time, the rules were strict. You didn't talk about contemporary religion or politics. It was too inflammatory, and that rule was meant starting under Henry VIII and continued through Queen Mary's reign as well. It was just too dangerous, and it was a fun way of doing it. So on the whole, Protestant and Catholic talked openly about what was happening on stage and in poetry within this clever double language. And on the whole, what Shakespeare says is not controversial. His whole aim and mission is to persuade the monarch to introduce the kind of toleration that Henry IV was doing across the Channel. Henry IV actually did the same thing. He came over and said to James, why don't you do this? It works with me. And if things had been different, James might have gone that way. So I think Shakespeare, like Constable and others, was, like any humanist writer, pulling the sleeve of the monarch and giving good advice. But in some of his plays, just a few, they were clearly written for the major dissident aristocratic faction who had a great deal of money, a great deal of influence, and were conservative, if you like. And I think the Stanleys were part of this clan, a very central part. And those plays, it's interesting, don't appear until the first folio. First folio comes out 1623, the first year of Catholic toleration for a long time. Suddenly, the bar was lifted, and a spread of Catholic-friendly and also Calvinist-friendly stuff came out in 1623. And it's worth somebody going and doing the research, because it looks to me superficially that the dates when the later folios came out also coincide with windows of Catholic toleration. So I think this was one of the plays, like Titus Andronicus, that was kept, but wasn't really seen by the court. Although Titus Andronicus did come out in court, actually. And that answers. And this brings up the question of were his plays meant to be read or not, which John Cox very interestingly brought up. And I don't know if anyone has any opinion on that.
equated the treachery with the goodness. And I'm wondering if there are other parts of the canon that maybe that theme shows up in, maybe even Hamlet, possibly the couplet of Sonnet 124.
I think, the word traitor is always there, isn't it, in Shakespeare's work, can be interpreted as a good word. It's extraordinary. The most extreme is in Macbeth, when the little boy, I can't recall the exact words of the scene, asks his mother, before he's killed, about what is a traitor, he says. And I just refer you back to that scene, because in childish logic he says, well, if there are more traitors than honest men, then more or less left there. If there are more traitors than honest men, then the traitors are fools. It is a positive good.
It's sure too.
Yeah.
Why?
Why don't they hang the honest men and establish their government there? They have the majority, that's the democratic government. Yes.
Right.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, I purchased your excellent book, Shadow Play, and I'm loving it. And I had a question about Queen Elizabeth I. In this book you mentioned that she owned her own set of rosary beads, and she had her own crucifix in the chapel, and yet it was against the law for Catholics to possess their own crucifix or have their own rosary beads. And could you speak to us a little bit about the conflict that Queen Elizabeth I felt about being, about her own relationship to Catholicism, because she portrayed herself as the Virgin Queen. So she banked on the love that the Catholics had on the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Yes. I'm not sure I said she had rosary beads. It may have been a slip in the sentence, but she definitely, as John Cox said in his talk, I didn't realise, until John said it, that she tried to get a crucifix into every church with the Virgin and St. John at the foot, which is very interesting. It seems let's imagine there were more traitors than honest men in England. If there really were, and you were the Queen of that country, it would make sense to foreground the Catholic aspect of your beliefs and to make the Catholics think that at any moment you were probably going to give them what they wanted. And I think if you look at her reign from that point of view, it's a very, very clever balancing act. She was always just about to marry someone, or just about to die, or just about to bring in toleration. It was very cunning. But as for her own beliefs, I would love someone else to talk about that, because Elizabeth believes her prayers are published, for instance, her writings you can get hold of. She was brought up, wasn't she, by Catherine Parr. I'm sure there are people here more expert in Queen Elizabeth's spirituality than me.
Last question.
Just an observation. If indeed Shakespeare was running close to the, sailing close to the wind in As You Like It, it wouldn't have been the first time. In Richard II, when it came out, Elizabeth was said to have mentioned to courtiers that she was Richard II in Shakespeare's mind, or intent, and yet he got away with it.
That was extraordinary. Yes, she said it was the archivist in the tower. They were going through the pictures. It was a rather nice little scene, and he says, "Ma'am, this is Richard II." And she says, "I am Richard II. No, ye not that." Looking at that in the episode, there were a number of Richard II plays, apparently, being played in the street because it was such a very obvious parallel to what people talking about the succession. This was what Parsons really had set the tone. This was a really good vehicle for talking about the pros and cons of deposition and so on. So what's very interesting about that is how did he get away with that? Because the company were summoned before the Privy Council, and yet somehow got away with it. And I think it was very powerful, friends. See, if you look at the composition of the court under Elizabeth, which is almost more important than the composition of what was in Elizabeth's head, that court was very largely crypto-Catholic. They were the old families who were fuming at these new guys who'd got all the best jobs. And they had money, and I'm sure money passed. If it's anything like Eastern Europe today, that's how it might have worked.